Have you ever imagined meeting someone who, without you knowing, completely changed the course of your life? What if that person was someone who, at the moment, had absolutely nothing, living on the streets, forgotten by the world? That's exactly what happened to Michael Jordan, the greatest basketball player of all time. But what no one expected was that this meeting would reveal a secret, capable of moving even the most skeptical. This story is not just about charity. It is not about a simple act of kindness from a millionaire to a homeless man. It's about destiny, about how life can surprise us in the most unbelievable way possible. And believe me, when Jordan found out who that man really was, he was speechless. And you will be too. Michael Jordan thought he was just helping a homeless man, but in the end, he was the one who received the biggest help of his life. And this is not just another story about charity, about an act of generosity by a millionaire to someone in need. What happened that night completely changed Jordan's perspective on the past, on destiny, and on the twists and turns that life can take. Just imagine, you're walking down the street. You see a person sitting on the sidewalk with torn clothes, looking lost, holding a small piece of cardboard with some words written on it. A common scenario in big cities, something that, unfortunately, many have become accustomed to seeing and ignoring. But Jordan, in that moment, felt something different. Something made him stop. Something made him look closer. The man before him didn't ask for money, didn't beg for food. The sign he was holding simply said, "We all have a story. No one knows mine." Those words moved Jordan in a strange way. He knew that his own story inspired millions of people around the world. Overcoming, effort, hard work. But what about that man's story? Who was he before he was there? Forgotten, ignored, practically invisible. Without thinking much, Jordan approached, crouched down beside the man and asked his name. The homeless man slowly raised his head. His tired eyes, full of the marks of time, met Jordan's. And then he spoke. Bill William Thompson. A common name, but it sounded like a distant echo in Jordan's mind. That name seemed familiar, but from where? Michael Jordan. A name that goes far beyond basketball. A name that carries greatness, glory, and a trajectory marked by overcoming. He didn't become the greatest player of all time just because of talent, but because he faced challenges that would have made anyone give up. From a young age, Jordan knew what it was like to fall and have to get up. He knew what it was like to be rejected, discredited, humiliated, but above all, he knew how to transform each fall into an impulse towards something even greater. If today he is a legend, an icon, an example of persistence, it is because in his youth he had to deal with moments that could have destroyed his confidence forever. Many don't know, but as a teenager, Michael Jordan was cut from his school basketball team. Yes, he, who years later would become the biggest name in the NBA, already heard a no that could have ended his career before it even began. The pain of being rejected, of seeing others occupy the place he dreamed of, was one of the most difficult moments of his life. But he didn't accept that as an end. On the contrary, he used frustration as fuel, trained harder, dedicated himself like no one else, and proved to himself and the world that he was different. But not every victory is limited to titles and trophies. There were other times in his life when money, fame, and records weren't enough to stop the pain, like the tragic loss of his father, brutally murdered in 1993. This was the hardest blow of his life. The man who always supported him, who was by his side every step of the way, was suddenly gone. Jordan was devastated, without ground, without motivation. It was at that moment that he made the most shocking decision of his career. He abandoned basketball at his peak, leaving fans and experts perplexed. He just couldn't go on. What no one imagined was that years later, on the sidewalk of any street, a simple encounter would remind him of something that, despite all his success, he had forgotten. And you, have you ever lived through a moment where you felt like everything was lost, but then life surprised you? Comment here. And if you also believe that destiny can put us in the right place at the right time, right fate never fails, in the comments. That night, Michael Jordan just wanted a moment of peace. He walked alone, trying to escape the hustle and bustle of the world around him. The life of an icon like him has never been exactly smooth. Even after years away from the court, the pressure, expectations, and ghosts of the past still accompanied him. But that night, with no flashbulbs, no reporters, no crowds surrounding him, he felt that, at least for a few moments, he could be just any man wandering the city streets. Jordan's footsteps echoed across the wet asphalt. The cold night breeze contrasted with the warm lights of the illuminated signs as people hurried past, each immersed in their own reality. But, amid this chaotic scenario, one detail caught his attention. In the corner of a sidewalk huddled against a concrete wall, a man sat, holding a piece of cardboard with some words scrawled on it. Unlike the other homeless people Jordan had seen, this one didn't ask for money, food, or any kind of help. The phrase written on the piece of cardboard was intriguing. "We all have a story. Nobody knows mine." Jordan stopped for a moment, watching the man. His face was marked by time. The wrinkles told stories that no one seemed willing to hear. His gray hair was disheveled. His long beard hid part of his tired face, and his clothes, dirty and worn, revealed years of suffering. Still, there was something about him, something that made Jordan hesitate before simply moving forward. Most people passed right by without even noticing his presence. For them, he was just another invisible person, but Jordan couldn't ignore it. There was something in that look, a glow that, despite all the sadness, still carried a spark of life. He approached slowly, bending down until he was at the man's level. "What is your name?" Jordan asked, his voice coming out softer than he expected. The man raised his head slowly, as if no one had addressed him directly for a long time. His eyes, sunken and marked with pain, met Jordan's. There was a brief silence before he finally responded. "William, but you can call me Bill Thompson." At that moment, something inside Jordan awakened. That name, there was something familiar about it, but from where? He couldn't remember. However, one thing was certain. That meeting was not just another chance. For a moment, Jordan just stood there, staring at the man. Something inside him said that this meeting was not by chance. He had seen many homeless people before. He had walked through streets full of people asking for help, but there was something different about Bill. The tired look, the posture huddled against the cold, the trembling hands holding that piece of cardboard. But above all, what caught his attention most was the fact that that man didn't ask for anything. No coins, no plates of food, no favors. He was just there, as if he was waiting for someone to really see him. Jordan reached into his pocket and took out some folded bills. He knew that money wouldn't change Bill's life, but it could at least guarantee a hot dinner that night. As he held out the bills, Bill looked at them and, surprisingly, hesitated. He looked up at Jordan and, instead of taking the money right away, asked something that took him by surprise. "Do you know what it's like to lose everything?" Bill's voice was hoarse, as if he hadn't spoken to anyone in a long time. Jordan felt a shiver. He didn't expect that question. He could have simply left the money there and gone on his way, but something inside him stopped him. He bent down beside the man and asked, "What happened to you?" Bill let out a long sigh, as if no one had cared about that answer in years. "I once had a completely different life. Family, home, a job that I loved. But life has a cruel way of taking everything from you when you least expect it." Jordan remained silent, giving him space to continue. "I've worked my whole life in sports, coaching, kids, helping shape their futures. I thought I was on the right path, but then I lost everything. First, my wife got sick, and I spent every penny trying to save her. Then, when she was gone, I fell apart. I lost my job, I lost my house, I even lost the will to move forward." Jordan felt a lump in his throat. He didn't know Bill, but somehow he could feel the pain behind his words. "And now?" Jordan asked, without even realizing he was still holding the bills in his hand. Bill gave a small, bitter smile and shook his head. "Now, I only exist." Jordan felt his chest tighten. He knew what the pain of loss was. I knew what it was like to have to start over from scratch, even when everything seemed hopeless. But what he didn't know, at that moment, was that this man who now found himself on the streets had already been a fundamental piece in his own past, and that, in a way he could never imagine, this encounter would change his life forever. Jordan remained there, still, listening to Bill's every word carefully. He had heard many sad stories throughout his life, but this one somehow seemed different. There was something about that man, something he couldn't explain, but that made every word carry a different weight. A man who once had everything, who helped so many people, but who was now there, invisible to the world. "You said you worked in sports." Jordan broke the silence, intrigued. "What exactly were you doing?" Bill sighed, as if remembering the past was painful. He looked at his hands, marked by time, and then said something that made Jordan's heart race. "I was a basketball coach." Jordan frowned. That sparked something in his mind, but he still didn't know exactly what. "I trained boys, young talents. I always thought my purpose was to help them achieve their dreams. Bill continued, his voice full of longing. I saw potential in them before they even knew they had it. Some became great players, others followed different paths. But I did, everything with passion. It gave me a purpose. Jordan felt a shiver. Why did that story feel so close? Did you train someone who stood out, someone who was successful? Bill squeezed his eyes shut, as if trying to search for memories that time and pain had buried. He shook his head. So many boys passed through my hand, but there was one that stood out. He had something special. It wasn't just talent. It was hunger for victory, as if basketball was more than a game to him. But I don't remember the name. Bill smiled with a nostalgic sparkle in his eyes. All I know is that he wanted to be the best. He always stayed after training, asked 1,000 questions, and didn't accept losing. Jordan froze. His heart beat faster. That sounded eerily familiar. This boy, Jordan swallowed. What was he like? Bill stared into space for a moment, trying to recall a memory that seemed too distant, thin, but he grew quickly. He worked hard. I wanted to prove something to the world. He said he would shut up those who didn't believe him. The words hit Jordan like a punch to the chest. He felt a chill run down his spine. It was impossible. It couldn't be a coincidence. But he needed to be sure. And where did this happen? What was the place? Bill scratched his head, confused. I think it was North Carolina. Jordan gasped. This wasn't just any story. This was part of his own story. Do you believe that destiny can bring people together in ways we would never imagine? Comment here. And if you think that nothing happens by chance, write in the comments, fate always finds a way. Jordan felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. His heart sped up, as if time had stopped in that instant. North Carolina. A skinny, determined boy, hungry for victory. He already knew the answer before he even heard the rest, but he needed to be sure. This boy. Jordan took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling at a rapid pace. What else do you remember about him? Bill closed his eyes for a moment, as if trying to pull out memories buried by time. His hands shook and he rubbed his face tiredly. I remember he didn't accept losing. Bill laughed softly, a nostalgic laugh full of longing. He got angry when he made a mistake, but he never gave up. I always asked for more. I told him, talent opens doors, but hard work keeps you inside. The words hit Jordan like a bolt of lightning. He remained motionless. His stomach turned. He had heard this phrase before. He had already experienced this phrase before. What? Jordan murmured, almost voiceless. I repeated that to him every day, Bill continued, without noticing Jordan's reaction. Talent opens doors, but hard work keeps you in. I wish he never forgot that. Jordan swallowed. He felt his body shiver. He knew this phrase more than any other, because it was with those words that he learned to never give up, because that phrase was one of the reasons he never stopped fighting, even when he was cut from the team at school, even when he lost his father, even when the world doubted him. Bill, Jordan murmured, his voice almost breaking. This boy? Bill looked at him confused. That boy was me. Silence took over the place. Bill blinked a few times, as if he didn't understand what Jordan had just said. He frowned, trying to process the information, trying to connect the pieces of a past he didn't quite remember. How it is? Bill asked, his voice cracking. Jordan felt a lump in his throat. He had never felt this way before. The greatest basketball player in history, the man who faced the NBA's greatest challenges, who shone in the most difficult moments, now stood there, speechless, in front of a man he hadn't seen in decades. You, Jordan swallowed. You were my coach. Bill continued looking at him, trying to find some familiar trait in the man in front of him. The wrinkles of time, the well-groomed beard, the eyes marked by life. Jordan was no longer the skinny boy who trained tirelessly, but that determined look was still there. My goddess, Bill whispered, putting his hand over his mouth. He was shaking. He looked at Jordan as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. The boy he trained, the boy he encouraged, the player he helped shape, was now standing there before him as one of the greatest sports icons of all time. Jordan felt his heart beating so hard, it felt like it was going to come out of his chest. He didn't know how to explain what he was feeling at that moment. It was as if time had folded in on itself, uniting past and present in ways he could never have imagined. Before him, sitting in the cold, abandoned by the world, was one of the men responsible for molding him, for transforming him into the player and the man he became. Bill was still staring at him, blinking a few times, trying to absorb the truth he had just heard. His face, marked by time and difficulties, trembled slightly. He wanted to believe it, but he couldn't. "What?" Bill whispered, his voice breaking. Jordan took a deep breath. He tried to control his emotion, tried to remain firm, but he felt a lump in his throat. His gaze was fixed on that man who had once been a pillar in his life, but who now didn't even have a roof over his head. "Bill," Jordan said in a firmer voice, "you changed my life when I was just a boy. Now it's my turn to give back." The silence between the two was interrupted by the sound of the surrounding city. People passed, cars, followed their paths, but in that small space on the sidewalk, there was only that moment. Bill opened his mouth to say something, but the words didn't come out. His eyes started to water, and he shook his head, still trying to understand. I don't believe it," he murmured. Jordan knelt down in front of him, held Bill's shoulders firmly, and looked straight into his eyes. "You were the one who taught me to never give up. It was you who believed in me when no one else did. You made me see that talent is nothing without hard work." Bill's eyes filled with tears. He started shaking his head from side to side in shock. "My God," he said softly. "Are you really you?" Jordan just nodded, feeling his own voice crack. He didn't know what was more difficult to accept, the fact that he had found Bill again after so many years, or the fact that that man, who had once been such an important part of his life, was now there, alone, living on the streets. Jordan was still holding Bill's shoulders, feeling the weight of emotion take over his body. He needed that man to understand the impact he had on his life. He needed him to know that his work, his teachings, his words were not in vain. "Do you remember that phrase you always said in training?" Jordan asked, his voice thick with emotion. Bill blinked a few times, confused, still trying to absorb it all. "Talent opens doors, but hard work keeps you in," Jordan repeated, almost whispering. Bill's eyes widened. That phrase was like his signature, something he always used to motivate his players. But he couldn't believe that, among all those boys who passed through his hands, one of them had become none other than Michael Jordan, the greatest basketball player in history. Jordan took a deep breath and continued, "I never told you this, but when I was cut from the school team, I thought about quitting. I thought maybe basketball wasn't for me. But I remembered what you always said, that talent wasn't enough, that I needed to train more than anyone else." Bill listened intently without blinking. "So I trained. I trained like never before. I spent nights alone in the gym, throwing over and over again, running, jumping, repeating each movement until exhaustion. And do you know why? Because your voice was still in my head. Your words kept me going." Bill put his hand on his chest, trying to contain his emotion. Are you saying that?" Jordan nodded firmly. "If it weren't for you, I might never have gotten where I am. Maybe I never would have become Michael Jordan." Bill let out a sob. Her shaking hands went to her face, trying to hide the tears that started to fall. He didn't know what to say. For years he believed that his legacy had been forgotten, that his existence no longer had a purpose. But here he was, facing a man who changed the world of sport, hearing that without his encouragement, without his words, that legend might never have existed. Jordan realized that no matter how much he had achieved everything, no matter how much he was a living basketball legend, this was one of the most significant moments of his life, because now he understood something he had never stopped to think about. Before he was an idol to millions, he had someone who believed in him when no one else did. Jordan looked at Bill and saw not just a man marked by time, but a teacher, a mentor, someone who, without even realizing it, had been one of the most important pieces of his journey. And now seeing him in that situation, abandoned by the world, forgotten by everyone, made something inside him awaken. He couldn't just walk away and leave Bill there, as if nothing had happened. Without thinking twice, Jordan got up, grabbed his phone and made a quick call. Bill just watched, still processing everything that had just happened. He didn't understand what Jordan was doing, but at that moment, he no longer knew what to expect. A few minutes later, a black car stopped at the corner. Jordan reached out to Bill, encouraging him to stand up. "Come on, Bill, you won't spend another night here." Bill hesitated. He looked at his own dirty clothes, at his torn shoes, at his aged, frost-bitten hands. "Jordan, He lowered his head, embarrassed. "I don't know what to say." Jordan placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then don't say anything. Just trust me." With some difficulty, Bill got up and got into the car with Jordan. The path was silent, but full of emotion. Bill still didn't seem to believe what was happening. When they arrived at the hotel, Jordan got out with him and went straight to the reception. "I want a room for him, the best you have." The hotel employee looked at Bill strangely, as if he didn't understand what a man in those clothes was doing there. But when he saw Jordan standing before him, he didn't ask any more questions. Within minutes, Bill was sitting on a comfortable bed, something that hadn't happened in years. He looked around, still trying to understand if this was real or just a dream. Jordan didn't stop there. The next day, he took Bill shopping for new clothes, cut his hair, and made sure he got a second chance. When everything was ready, Jordan turned to him and said, "You helped me when I needed it most. Now it's my turn to do the same." Bill couldn't hold back the tears. He looked at Jordan, and in that instant, it wasn't the basketball legend he saw before him, but rather the determined boy he once coached. The two hugged. In that embrace, Jordan felt something that no victory, no title, no award could give him. For years, he was seen as a legend, a symbol of overcoming, an example of determination. But there in front of Bill, he realized a truth that few recognize. No one wins alone. If he got where he is, it was because someone back there believed in him before he even believed in himself. Life has mysterious ways of teaching us lessons. Sometimes we think we are helping someone, but in the end, we are the ones who receive the greatest gift. Small gestures, words spoken at the right time, attitudes that seem insignificant can change a destiny forever. Bill may have lost everything, but he never lost the impact he had on Jordan's life. And now, fate had found a way to unite their stories once again. And that makes us wonder, how many people have crossed our path and left a mark without us even realizing it? How many times has a simple piece of advice, silent support, or even an act of kindness completely changed the course of our lives? Now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever had a moment when an unexpected person made a difference in your life? Tell me here in the comments. And if you believe that nothing happens by chance, right, fate always finds a way. But wait, if you think this story was surprising, you won't believe what happened the day Michael Jordan took an Uber. It was one of the most unbelievable coincidences of his life, something that seemed impossible. Run and click on the video that is appearing on the screen now to discover this story that will leave your jaw dropping.